Lost Private. We're in Normandy.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 22 of the We're Not Lost Private podcast. I'm Joe Muccia, your host. And for this week's pod, I got a bit of inspiration from going on a couple of Band of Brothers Facebook pages that I frequent. We had quite a few folks come up and basically start asking lots of questions about Easy Company, the real Easy Company in particular, not just stuff from the miniseries. And what I noticed was there was a lot of consistency among the questions. There were certain individuals in the company and characters as they were portrayed in the miniseries that folks still have a lot of questions about. And I thought it would be a good idea as we begin the run up to the 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, and that to do a show or kind of just do answer some questions that folks had posed. Now, if you frequent either one of these two pages, Band of Brothers Company Headquarters or Band of Brothers Behind the Scenes, you might have read these threads. So some of this will be very familiar to you if you kept up with those Q&A sessions. If you haven't, I hope you'll stick around and maybe learn a few things about certain members of the company that might not know about, or maybe you thought you knew and maybe get a little bit more clarity about truth versus fiction. So I hope this will serve to answer some of those outstanding questions that are out there. Once again, we are on patreon.com / We're Not Lost Private Podcast. If you want to become a member, it's only $3 a month. You get all kinds of extras and bonus materials. This very sporadic podcast newsletter, which I definitely owe you guys one. And then, of course, I'm always open to have user submitted questions sent to me, and then I can answer them and get them back to it. There's lots of bonuses, not to mention the podcast itself. $3 is not a lot of money to help me keep the lights on, so to speak, and keep the podcast running and paying for all the services I use to make sure I get this to you at least bi-weekly, if not sooner than that. But you can also find us on all of your major podcatchers, including Amazon, Apple podcasts. You can also find us on Spotify. So pretty much any podcatcher you frequent, you can probably find our pod on there. Just do a search for We're Not Lost Private Podcast, and you'll find it in all the back episodes, which is great if you want to go back to listen to anything. So without any further ado, I'll get to some of these questions. I'll bring them up from both pages. And of course, nothing wants to work right now. So bear with me as I find my way back to where I was and bring up the questions. I do. The first one was from a fellow named Daniel, who is an Army veteran. He had a very good question about Norman Dike. And I thought that it would be a great opportunity to kind of dispel some of the myths about Foxhole Norman, and some of the things that people might be wondering about old Norman Dike. And the first and foremost was, and I get to ask this one quite a bit, was Dike wounded during the assault on Foix? And there's a misconception out there that he was, because in the miniseries, they show what it looks like him getting wounded in the shoulder. And the truth is he was not, at least based on what the answers I received from members of the company that were nearby while he was making his way to the towards the town. In addition, there's no paperwork to support it, that whether or not he was wounded, and there is no evidence of any Purple Heart paperwork being filed or him being carried on the morning report for either service company or Easy Company or regimental headquarters of him being awarded a Purple Heart during that period of time. Now, in one case, Clancy Lyle did state, "I thought I saw him wounded during that action. Now, the thing you have to remember about Clancy was he did not accompany the assault elements into the town. What happened was as Easy Company was moving into its positions, first and second platoon, at one portion, one attack route in, and then third platoon on a wide flanking maneuver around to the east of the town. Clancy and the rest of the machine gunners and the mortarmen were all put in what I like to label as they were put in battery. Essentially, they were held back so they could provide supporting fires for the assault troops going in, the infantrymen going in. And this was told to me by Jack Foley. And Jack basically said, he goes, I had to drop off my machine gun teams, which included Clancy, and my mortar team back at company headquarters before the company began its movement in. But those machine gun teams and the mortar teams were to stay there and provide those supporting fires. So Clancy wasn't even up with the assault elements to observe Dike in person. And again, he only said to me directly, this is what Clancy said, I thought I saw him wounded. Now, there's a big difference between I saw him wounded and I thought I saw him wounded. And the fact that there is no paperwork trail, so to speak, about any wounding of Norman Dike. Now, the other thing that I always get asked about Dike is, why was he portrayed the way he was? Was he that bad? And I wouldn't say it's a very nuanced answer to this question. It's not a good bad. It was he really prepared to do that job? And you have to remember that Dike, although had gone through he had gone through the training with the rest of the 506 in the prep to move overseas, and then of course all the training iterations. But at the time he was working in regimental headquarters, he was part of the S4 team, and then he was in service company as well. And as a result, he wasn't an infantryman, and he didn't do it all day long. He wasn't tried and true infantryman. Wasn't going through full-length infantry training. He wasn't performing infantry tasks. And as they got to England and they started the run-ups to D-Day, he definitely wasn't practicing infantry tactics day and night. He was simply operating as he should as an S4 officer, a logistics officer. Now, to take somebody who hasn't done the job and isn't prepared for it, and to put them into a high pressure situation like Bastogne and expect him to lead a very experienced parachute infantry company and do it well was, for lack of a better phrase, a bridge too far. You're asking him to do something he was ill-equipped to do. And therefore, the result was not very good. It was what you saw, and he was relieved. Now, he landed on his feet. Now, I will say this, I'm not disparaging Dike. He performed heroically in Operation Market Garden. He was decorated for gathering up a group of paratroopers and leading them to their primary objective, which was the bridge over the Wilhelmina Canal, which ended up getting blown in the face of the initial elements of 2nd Battalion as they made their approach. This is, again, not disparaging his personal courage, but he was ill-equipped to lead a parachute infantry company in combat. And when he was called on to do so, he did not perform adequately enough. Now, he fell on his feet. He was, as Winters has written about in his biography, he was a favorite up at regimental headquarters and up at division headquarters. He had certain characteristics that endeared him to leadership, and he landed on his feet. Now, should his legacy been better cared for? Well, you were asking men who were in their 20s and experiencing the hell of Bastogne, and watched several members of their company get killed because of poor leadership on Dike's part, wounded and killed. And you're asking him to be very charitable about his memory, in which they don't have to be. So I understand where people want to kind of get involved and take ownership and say it's bad bad play on the writers' parts or the vets' parts to talk ill about him, but the vets have every right to talk about him any way they want. They were the ones who served underneath him. The writers just took the material they were given and transcribed that into something that could be portrayed on screen. So I do have some sympathy for him. He was put in a terrible situation, and he did not perform up to standard, and was subsequently relieved. But I do have some sympathy for him because of the situation he was put in. But at the end of the day, it's a life and death business, and sympathies don't get you very much. But it was a great discussion, and I really want to thank Dan Hoyle for putting that question forward, because it led to some really great discussions about um, legacy and legacies of men that were portrayed in the mini series, and how whose role is it to um, safeguard that legacy. Um, but in this case, I thought there was nothing wrong with the way it was dealt with, and I thought it was nothing wrong with um, how it ended up bearing out. And then Dan also put out a question about Walter Gordon during in the miniseries. He's shot and paralyzed, um, as portrayed by Ben Kaplan, and then treated by the Doc Rowe character and the Carwood Lipton character and brought offline. And Dan wanted to know, what happened with Walter. And I thought one of the great aspects of sites like these are there are some of the Easy Company families are available to talk about it. And Walter's son Scotty came on and basically told his story about what happened with Walter, his paralyzation, and his eventual recovery. But he did go on to say that Walter lived the rest of his life with severe back pain. So while Walter did recover, um, it wasn't without a cost. But he was a frequent attendee to all the reunions, and lived a very long life and raised beautiful children who I'm lucky enough to be friends with. Um, and so I hope we adequately answered Dan's questions about Walter and Norman Dike. Um, and I enjoyed doing so much that I went onto the Band of Brothers company headquarters page, and I started a thread, and I basically said, are there any questions out there that anyone wants to ask about any of the men in the company that I'll do my best to try and answer. And Stephanie asked a question about Roy Cobb. Obviously, Cobb's portrayed in the miniseries by Craig Heaney, and I thought he did a wonderful job, although he was a little bit off from what I was told about Cobb by a number of the vets. But I still think he did a great job, because he did capture some of the essence of Cobb, at least based on my understanding of him. And her question had to do with what happened to Cobb after the incident with Lieutenant Foley, because in the miniseries, they show him having a run-in with Lieutenant Jones, who was actually with Second Platoon. But Cobb was actually in Lieutenant Foley's first platoon at the time. And Foley was the one who he had the incident with that they show in the miniseries. But it's truncated because the scene was cut, and some of it hit the cutting room floor, where they actually have Cobb being arrested for insubordination and being drunk on duty. He was both of those things, and he was eventually charged. And when Foley brought the charge sheets up to Colonel Sink, I found it interesting that Colonel Sink's response was that you should have shot him and saved us the paperwork, which I thought was really interesting, because Sink had for the longest time shown a lot of respect and a lot of caretaking of his vets who had made it through all the campaigns. And Cobb had been wounded on the aircraft on the way into D-Day, and as is shown in the miniseries, he's wounded, and then he's brought back by the aircraft for treatment, and then he eventually makes Holland and the Bastogne missions, and into Hagenau, where we see the incident as portrayed in the miniseries. So I thought it was very interesting of Sink's response about him. But he ends up going to the regimental guardhouse, and he serves out his time. He's reduced in rank, and he's eventually reassigned to the 2nd Battalion headquarters in the light machine gun platoon, where his platoon leaders were Carwood Lipton and Henry Jones. So I always thought the Cobb character was a very interesting one, and Johnny Martin wrote about him pretty extensively. And I asked a few of the other men, Frank Bracani in particular, about Cobb, and they said, he was kind of a easygoing, fun-loving kind of guy, except for when he got into the liquor, and then he became a bit caustic. And Johnny had said he was a bit of a gold bricker, and he was definitely one of his best scroungers. And it was interesting because Cobb has a fairly well-known history about his service with the First Armored Division in North Africa, and then the sinking of his troop ship afterwards. And then he's rescued, and then he comes back to the States and volunteers for um, parachute infantry duty, which I found for a guy who was a kind of a gold bricker and avoided, based on what Martin said, avoided, duty to volunteer for the paratroops. I always wondered what was his motivation. I mean, it could have been like a lot of the other men told me, hey, I wanted that extra $50 a month, which makes complete sense when you think about it. But I hope that that answered Stephanie's question fully. Um, there were lots of interesting questions about Sobel, particularly from Joanne, who was one of the mods over there at the headquarters company page, company headquarters page. Sorry about that. Some of it had to do with what my opinion was about his mental state. And, I'm not a doctor. I wouldn't pretend to be one or try and diagnose him, as I told Joe. But I did say that, to me, the thing that rang out about Sobel was his lack of confidence in his own ability. Um, and that's, to me, it makes most sense when you think about how Winters described how Sobel, when he was unsure of himself or um, unsure about the things he was doing, whether it be map reading or what have you, he would just get mean and take it out on the men even more so than what we think we know about how he disciplined the men or how it was portrayed in the miniseries. In fact, to add some insight to that, when I talked to Bill Garnier about um, Sobel and his opinion of Schwimmer's portrayal, and he said, "Oh, I think he did a great job, but he wasn't anywhere near as mean as the real deal." In Bill's words, and I thought that was pretty amazing when you think about how he wasn't. I mean, and he looks pretty mean in terms of how he treats the men, and almost every one of those things that you see portrayed is based on a real incident. The only thing, interestingly, that they didn't portray was Sobel's propensity to task wayward troopers with digging 6 by 6 by 6 pits, and then the moment they were done, making them fill them in. That was apparently his favorite form of punishment, that and restricting men to base and withholding passes. So, I mean, in my opinion, I think Sobel lacked the confidence in his own abilities. And also Winter said he didn't have a lot of friends, which would give you a lot of feedback. If you've served in the military, you got a core of guys that you're friends with, guys and gals that you're friends with, generally around the similar rank, and they're the ones that kind of keep you real. And I don't think Sobel had the benefit of that because he didn't have a lot of friends. Not one of the second battalion officers that I ever talked to mentioned being even on reasonably friendly terms with him. He was kind of a loner and he kept to himself. This is not to say that what he did was not without merit. Again, I always point out what Rod Stroll told Ambrose and told me when I spoke with him. Sobel made easy company. And a lot of the men over the years are able to reconcile that, um, get past their feelings that they possessed when they were 20-year-old men and really, with life experience, be able to understand why the things were done the way they were done. And the fact was, he produced a hell of a rifle company. And Winters said as much the same, but he when he wrote about it, he also said he could have done the same thing, but without all the chicken shit. Um, um, and if you don't know what chicken shit means, please look it up. I don't want to dedicate a bunch of time to explaining what it means. It's just taking things that are kind of meaningless or of a low value and heightening their value and their meaningfulness and using that as a disciplinary method. And he was very good at it. But let's see, what's another question that got dropped that I thought they were really good. Forrest Guth, Goody, was a personal favorite. I love spending time with him and his wife Harriet. They were fantastic people. Josh, one of the mods there, asked about. We didn't hear a lot about him, and part of that is because the miniseries, they couldn't feature every member of the company. In fact, they had taken the jumpsuit that they had designed for Forrest, because everybody who knows a little bit about Forrest knows that his jumpsuit, he sewed pockets all over it so he could, in his words, hide goodies, candy bars and things of that nature. Um, but he was a bit of a tinkerer, and Josh asked me what any stories stick out about him, and I said, yeah, the fact that he was the company armorer artificer, which means it was his job to do localized weapons maintenance and keep and repairs to keep everybody's weapons working when they couldn't get them back to battalion level and higher for that kind of service. So he was furnished a kit of tools that he was able to use to make minor repairs on the weapons. And one of the things that Forrest liked to do was tinker. And what he did at one point was take an M1 carbine, and he was able to mill down the sear in it to basically create. For those of you who don't know, an M1 carbine is a semi-automatic weapon. That means every time you pull the trigger, a bullet comes out of the barrel. Um, for an automatic weapon, it's when you pull back the trigger and you hold it, it'll just keep firing until you run out of ammunition. Well, what he was able to do was convert those semi-automatic carbines into automatics by milling the sear down. And he did this for a number of troops, including a number of officers in Easy Company. And one of them, a rather fairly well-known officer who was wounded outside of Eindhoven, had his weapon done. Um, and then there's another story about Bastogne and Forrest's resourcefulness that if you like to hear those stories, as I told in the thread, you're going to have to come on my tour to hear them, because I tell them where those things happened, and how it happened. Um, so those are the bulk of the questions that I thought were really good. I mean, there were some other good ones. Had Keith Moore asked me about how many planes were shot down on D-Day. There were over 800 C-47s that flew the D-Day period, and I consider that D-Day all the way through D+2. Of the over 800, and I want to say it was 813, somewhere around there, 42 aircraft were shot down, and this is supporting both the 82nd and the 101st Airborne. He also asked about casualties. For the 101st Airborne, they deployed 14,201 troops during the D-Day period. Again, D plus. They suffered almost 4,000. It was 3,836 killed, wounded, and missing in action. Those missing in actions eventually will include POWs as well. So oh, under a quarter of the 101st Airborne end strength were casualties of some kind during the D-Day period. Let's see if there's any more questions. There were some good questions about the actors boot camp and which of the actors attended the boot camp. And you can probably watch Ron Livingston's video diaries that are part of the box set, and just kind of count noses and names, and you'll figure out who went to the boot camp. There's some great stories out there. Great interviews being done with a lot of those guys, and historically have been done. So I won't kind of go into the nuts and bolts of who went where. Had a gentleman named Jeff ask about a list of the men's names who served in Easy Company throughout the war. And the only ones, unfortunately, that are out there in the public domain are incomplete. But he did ask for a reason, because he wanted to check and verify that Ralph Spina was a member of the company, and Spina did serve in the company. He was a late war addition, served as a medic with Easy Company and 2nd Platoon. He was a Philadelphia guy, so he was part of the little posse of of South Philly and Philly guys that served in Easy Company, which include Ralph Trapezzano, obviously Bill and Babe, Ralph Spina, Albert Blythe was from Philly as well. Had a number of people ask me about Blythe and why didn't the production company, once they found out that he did not die during the war, just after the war, and he actually served all the way through. That's something you have to ask the production team and HBO about why they haven't fixed it yet. I would think just a simple postscript, um, you know, that episode would update it and answer it properly, because there's lots of ways that they could take care of that and make sure that it's a question they answer, and so it doesn't leave people wondering about um, why they haven't addressed it. For those of you that don't know, Blythe served until 1967, where he actually passed away during, if I want to say it was a perforated liver. He was actually over in Europe for the Battle of the Bulge anniversary. He was visiting the site when he suffered a medical incident, and he had to be treated, and he unfortunately didn't survive it. But he served for quite a long time. He was an outstanding paratrooper. Had served at the 82nd as well. He was, I want to say he was the Division Trooper of the Year at one point. He serves in an exchange program with the Chinese Army and their paratrooper forces. So, um, Albert served for quite a long time. There are lots of little nuggets about his personality that exist out there. Again, I'm writing my own 4-volume history of the company. Quite a bit of Albert's history will be in there as well, kind of setting the record straight a little bit and then providing a little insight into who he was. But he was a well-liked and well-loved member of First Platoon, and I think folks are going to be excited to understand some of the ins and outs of his personality and how he reacted and interacted with his first platoon troopers. I'll give a hat tip to Matthew Pellett, who wrote a great book about actions of the 101st in England prior to D-Day, and I provided him with some material about Albert during one of the live fire sessions. If you've read Matthew's book, then you've read it before. If you haven't, you can probably find it on eBay maybe. But it's a very good book, and it deals with all of the regiments assigned to the 101st Airborne. So there's lots of good information about the 501st and the 502nd, 506th. I want to say the 327th Glider Riders too. So there's lots of good stuff there. So, and I think we're pretty much going to wrap it up here. I realize it's a short episode. I apologize to everybody. The holidays have kind of impacted my recording schedule. In a couple of weeks, I'll be taking a tour group out to the 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. We'll be touring all around the Ardennes. So I look forward to seeing as many of you out there as I can. And again, if you're willing, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter and helping to keep the podcast going. But I hope everybody got something out of this, and I really enjoyed doing it. And thanks again to both of those pages for hosting those discussions. I hope to keep doing them. There is a thread on the company headquarters page that I started. If you've got a question about Easy Company or any member of it, feel free to go and post it in there, and I'll do my best to answer them. If your questions more around hover around more of the mini series topically, hop onto Band of Brothers behind the scenes and pop your questions in there, and I will do my best to answer it. But the great thing about that page is there's members of the cast and crew on it, and the production team, and they can probably provide a lot more insight than I can. But either way, please don't be bashful. I really like doing these Q&A sessions, and if I get more of them, I'll be glad to turn them into future episodes. Coming up, there might be a little bit of a pause, just through the tour dates, and when I get back, it'll be basically just before Christmas week. I will try and pump an episode out after Christmas. Hopefully, be a bit kind of a trip report for Bastogne. For those of you who don't get to travel there, I will be posting on my social media accounts about the trip. Hope you'll follow along and maybe get something out of it. And then after the new year, really starting in earnest with a whole slew um, of shows focusing on the 101st Airborne in Normandy. I'll also have Bob Koenig's coming on to talk about the fighting around Manet and Grand Minel around the 24th of December all the way through the 26th of December. Some pretty interesting fighting there. 3rd Armored Division, 75th Infantry Division, 82nd Airborne stuff. I'm also trying to get my buddy Niels to come back on and talk about the 2nd volume of his Defending Normandy book series. It's just released, if memory serves. And I want to get him back on so he can talk more about his outstanding contribution to the Normandy historiography, the D-Day historiography. I'm also going to have my friends Joe and Edwin come on, and we're all going to pitch in and do a show about Operation Pegasus, which was the rescue of the Red Devils by Easy Company, the 506. There's so much more to that story, and only a little bit of it was portrayed in the miniseries and in Ambrose's Band of Brothers book. There's so much more to it, and we're going to get to all of it. And if I've omitted anybody that's in the queue to come on the show and record with me, and I apologize. But if you want, hop on the We're Not Lost Private podcast Facebook page. Pretty much everything in there is listed, the future shows. It's just a matter of stapling them to a date and releasing them. This one will go out tomorrow. I'll do the editing tonight and pop it out there. Again, thanks for following along, and I look forward to seeing everybody the next time. Bye.